Syria, 4 months after his election. France's new president this Monday, meeting his diplomatic corps in an annual rendezvous that sets the tone on foreign policy. Last week in the debate, we asked how France would weigh on Europe, but diplomacy is not all about the economy. Today, there's a major civil war unfolding at the other end of the Mediterranean. On Syria, Hollande has toed the same firm line as his predecessor. So far, though, he's balked at Sarkozy's recent suggestion of implementing a no-fly zone over parts of that country. What policy for France under a socialist government? That also begs the question, what's Paris's pull on the world stage at this moment? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the world according to Hollande, and with us to talk about it, Régis Le Sommier of French weekly news magazine Paris Match. Welcome back, sir. Louis Peral of the European Institute for Security Studies. Welcome.
Hello.
Just back from Syria's second city, Aleppo, where he's witnessed the fighting firsthand, Ole Selvang of Human Rights Watch. Thank you for being with us. And from Washington, Robert Zarate of the Foreign Policy Initiative think tank. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate, where you can weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. You can find us at François F24. Now, at that annual meeting of French ambassadors, François Hollande tried to shed his understated image, echoing recent warnings by the US and Britain that chemical weapons would be legitimate reason to intervene. He urged Syria's opposition to form a provisional government that Paris could recognize, and he called on Damascus's backers to ease off.
This is why I say to Russia and China that in the Syrian crisis, their attitude hampers our ability to accomplish the mandate that the United Nations Charter has entrusted us with. I would like to advance, then, the reform of the Security Council to allow new permanent and non-permanent members to sit in session.
All right, Louis Peral, François Hollande's speech, was it effective?
It's too early to say. Of course, mentioning that the use of chemical weapons is a red line amounts to saying nothing very much. We all know that the regime is targeting certain suburbs and certain villages and not willing to use indiscriminate weapons for the time being. The question of the non-fly zone is, in my view, more important. Because it's time now to protect victims and to guarantee secure access to humanitarian aid. And this could be one of the ways of doing that, especially if it's limited, connected to Aleppo and between Aleppo and Turkey, in a territory that is under the control of the rebels. That could work. I believe that at this stage, we need to use all possible means in order to protect victims.
Ole Selvang, from what you saw in Aleppo in the last few days, is it doable?
Well, I think before I answer your question, let me just tell you that I completely agree with what was said, that the situation in northern Aleppo is quite dire. We spent time in Aleppo city. Just last Friday, for example, I was in a hospital in Aleppo city when there was a fighter jet that attacked, and it hit 2 buildings away from us. But it was quite clear that the target of the attack was the hospital, and it's the 7th time that the hospital has been attacked.
You were sure of that? That the target was the hospital?
Well, I think you can never be 100% sure, but the hospital has been attacked several times before. If you look at the direction of the attack, the rocket, it was going straight towards the hospital. It was just falling a little bit short. The point is that civilians in Aleppo and in northern Aleppo, the countryside as well, are dying because of these aerial attacks. And I think President Hollande was quite right in emphasizing Russia and China's role in blocking any kind of meaningful discussion of this. And I think it is time to start talking about what other means could be taken to protect civilians, including putting on table a no-fly zone.
But that would mean bypassing the UN Security Council.
Well, of course, ideally, you would have a UN Security Council authorization for any kind of action that you take. But, reality is that Russia and China so far have blocked any kind of meaningful action by the Security by the Security Council. And I do think it is possible that we start looking at options and start discussing them at least.
Robert Zarate, was that the right way to go about it if you're trying to put pressure on Russia and China?
Yes, I think that President Hollande does deserve credit for highlighting the negative role that Russia and China are playing in the UN Security Council. And I agree with the other two interviewees that it's long past due for the United States, for France, for the responsible members of the international community to start taking real steps to protect civilians, to vet and identify those in the internal armed opposition with whom we can work, and to hasten the emergence of a post-Assad Syria. It's not only in America's national security interest and France's national security interest, but it's also in regional security interest to do this.
Régis Le Sommier, we're talking about a no-fly zone. There's the mention of chemical weapons being a red line. Haven't we seen this movie before?
We have seen a bit of this movie, but I would like to stress the fact that President Hollande he has taken the steps of not doing like his predecessor. Meaning,
how so?
Nicolas Sarkozy during the Libyan crisis and the Libyan war has always been try to be ahead of the Americans, try to push, France and England were trying to be, force the American into intervention. It was much more easy back then because there was no opposition or, the Russians agreed and then they disagreed, but at first, they backed anything that was, and in this time we have a stalemate and we don't have an agreement of the UN Security Council. But Hollande wants to try several options. He doesn't want to go to be ahead of the Americans. The question of the red line with the chemical weapons has been drawn by Obama before, and Hollande has put himself and try to find several different ways of doing things. I think that's his style, but that's also a way of not rushing, and to a point that even in his camp, people are saying, what went beyond, what happened during the summer is France now turned towards indecision, after having had a president that was very active on the foreign front. Are we now going to have somebody who's much more inactive, I would say? And this, putting on the table those various options, I think Hollande is willing to say, I'm active, but don't want to rush. I don't want to, go alone. I don't want to do, like Sarkozy did, because the case of Syria, and let's remind that it's much, much complicated than the case of Libya.
All right, the head of Human Rights Watch France, by the way, penning a column in tonight's edition of Le Monde entitled Human Rights Waiting for the Unraveling of Sarkozyism, in which he says we expect much more from the French presidency, which shouldn't hide behind the voice of Europe. Ole Sylvain, does that apply as well to Syria? You just heard Régis Le Sommier mention how some inside of Hollande's own camp are impatient for him to be a little bit more outspoken when it comes to Damascus.
Well, I think it is extremely important that everybody is outspoken. At the same time, I think it is a very good point that Syria...
So has Hollande been too cautious?
I think in general, France has been quite good and quite outspoken, and they have taken the initiative on certain issues. I think the EU as a whole has been not as strong as we wanted to. And I think that's a position that's an area where the French can also help push more to get a stronger, unified European Union position on these things. And in particular, and very concretely, an issue that we have been disappointed with is the lack of strong push for an ICC referral for the United Nations Security Council to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court. Now,
which François Hollande paid lip service to in his speech before the ambassadors this Monday.
Nobody is so naive to think that an ICC referral will end the killing overnight. But I think it is extremely important that we don't leave any options untried in terms of putting additional pressure on the Syrian government at this point to end the violations.
Would you agree that Europe has been too standoffish?
I cannot agree more. Yes. I believe that Europe has not performed the task that it imposed itself when the Lisbon Treaty was approved. In terms, for example, of...
Why is that?
There's an impasse in Brussels during the last couple of years that is jeopardizing the possibility of finding consensus. Even is jeopardizing the possibility of honoring the obligations of the treaty.
But on Syria specifically, where is there an impasse? Do some of the members of the EU agree with Russia and China on this?
There are many reasons. I don't think there's only one reason. I think Libya was one of the reasons that Syria is not working well in Brussels. But already in Libya, the fact that NATO took the lead and the EU was sidelined has not helped for the EU to really have a role in this crisis.
So the specter of Libya looming large, and once again, everyone remembers the hands-on style of Hollande's predecessor.
Vive Benghazi! Vive la Libye! Vive l'amitié entre la France et la Libye!
Nicolas Sarkozy, who, by the way, broke his post-election defeat silence at the start of this month to co-author a statement with the new Syrian National Council president, where he and Abdel Basset said agreed that there are great similarities with the Libyan crisis. Robert Zarate, do you miss Nicolas Sarkozy?
You know, I think when it came to Libya, President Sarkozy very much forced the issue. He forced President Obama to face the Benghazi moment, the fact that the Gaddafi regime could slaughter many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. What's tragic about what we see today is that the very things that the United States, France, and NATO intervened in Libya to prevent have been happening in slow motion over the last year and a half in Syria. And what's worse, President Obama himself, almost a year ago, a little more than a year ago actually, demanded that Assad step down, but since then has not implemented a real strategy to implement that policy. And so what we have today, what I worry about is we'll have more of the same, certainly until the U.S. elections. But what's going on is a tragedy, not only in humanitarian terms, but also in strategic terms.
So do you think
the Assad regime...
the
yes,
fact that
please.
you hear Régis Le Sommier mentioning how Hollande has been more deferential when it comes to speaking with Washington and London before acting, do you think that the French should be the ones taking charge like they did with Libya?
You know, personally, I'm glad that President Hollande has raised the issue. I would prefer to see an American president that also works with the responsible members of the international community, including President Hollande, to very proactively deal with the Syria issue. But we're not seeing that. Until we have an American president that's willing to lead, I'm glad to see other leaders at least raising the issue and highlighting its importance.
Ole Selvang, your thoughts?
Well, I think I agree that it is extremely vital now, but I think we need to get back to what is also the problem.
But do you agree when Robert Zarate says that right now Obama doesn't have a policy?
I think it is difficult. I think a lot of leaders do not have a policy, state leaders do not have a policy, and I think it partly, you know, what we spoke about, we mentioned the EU and that EU could have a stronger position as well. I think partly it has been an opinion, or very often we hear arguments by policymakers that, you know, we cannot put too much pressure because that would jeopardize finding a political solution. We cannot refer the situation to the ICC, we cannot impose sanctions, etc. And I think that is to some extent, and we've seen that they focused very much on the Annan plan and the attempts to find a solution through political dialogue. But I think that is a misguided notion that somehow putting pressure, somehow calling for accountability will undermine a political solution. I think if you look at past experiences in the Balkans, in Liberia, what you see is often the opposite, that by putting pressure on the people in power, by having an ICC referral, by having an indictment, you very often will be able to marginalize those who are obstacles to a political solution, those who are the perpetrators of the most serious human rights violations.
I'd like to add a few things, like compare. I mean, we've been doing the comparison between the Syria crisis right now and the Libyan crisis about 6 months ago. In Libya, it was rather easy from the early stage, to find valid people who could, you know, form. And there was, you know, of course, the sort of free zone in Benghazi that, you know, Benghazi was threatened, and then the intervention sort of created that zone. But from an earlier stage, there were people that the West, including the Americans, could rely on. The opposition in Syria is much more split. They are, of course, the Americans, the CIA is present over there, but and a number of other intelligence community are looking at who are these groups, and you probably know a lot about them. From my understanding, there are still elements that are coming to Syria to fight jihad. You have elements outside, leading or claiming to be the name of the opposition outside Syria. You have some inside. So it's very split. And what Hollande said today was, there would be a recognition, or there might be a recognition of a body of government, and then which could help. But it's not there yet. And that is something for, I would say, for the American president, that is difficult to find. That is difficult to find a legitimate body of government that could, create the new Syria state. And the opposition again is really, really split. That's.
Well,
I'd like to have your view on that.
Yeah, I think you're quite right in that. I wouldn't make too much out of a jihadi element or jihadi fighters. We didn't come across any particular elements of those. The opposition is definitely split, and there are those who are very pro-democracy, very pro-human rights. There are those who are more pro-Islamic and see that as much more of a goal of the revolution. I think what is clear when you speak to people on the ground, however, is that they feel abandoned and they feel isolated, and they feel that the West in particular has left them to fight this fight on their own, and left them to, at the mercy of Assad's forces. And I think that is one of, also a very important argument why I think Western leaders in particular needs to be stronger in the way that they discuss.
But they've done sanctions to the hilt. What can they do that's stronger, short of imposing that no-fly zone, of putting boots on the ground?
They have done sanctions individually. What they have been, what has been difficult, and what they haven't done yet is to come together. And of course, Russia and China is an obstacle. But I think they need to keep harping on that. They need to put pressure on Russia and China, and need to keep calling them out. France has the presidency at the Security Council, and I think it is important for them, even if they think that a resolution might be vetoed. I think it is important to table those resolutions and to call out Russia and China on why they are blocking a solution to this crisis.
We're going to be talking about the Security Council when we come back. Ole Sylvain, I know you have to leave us early because you have a plane to catch, so thanks for being with us. Stay with us, because when we return, we'll be looking at what France can do in New York and around the world when it comes to this. Stay with us.